I'm going to be making a kitchen knife, 180 millimeter general chef knife, starting with a piece of steel, 15 and 20. Yeah, we're going to see how it goes. Normally this would take probably around 3 days. Got a day for the blade forging, about a day for grinding and hand sanding, and then another day for the handle. So right now the blade is quite curved, and it's curved in the wrong direction. So the edge is sort of a concave curve, and the spine is way over curved. It also looks really messy. But one really important thing about forging knives is that you need to get the geometry right, especially if you're going to be leaving the scale finish on the blade. So what I'm working on right now is basically tapering the spine. So I've got it thickest up here, thinnest down here. I've still got to do more work towards the tip. But in doing that, I'm basically stretching out the spine. And when you do that, it pushes the edge down because you've got two lines. And if you stretch this one, if you make this one longer, you're going to be pushing the other line down. But that's good because when I then come to thin out the edge, I'm going to be stretching this edge. And if I didn't curve this edge first before I curve this edge, I end up with the opposite thing happening, and I end up with a knife that's edge looks like this, and the spine is very concave. And for a chef's knife, I personally don't like that look, so I'm going to go with a sort of more Japanese shape, which is where the tip kind of drops down a little bit, especially near the front. But otherwise, the spine should be relatively straight once I bevel the knife and get the geometry exactly where I want it. Because this is a fully forged knife and I want it to keep some scale on there, I kind of want to have the edge geometry, so the actual shape of the cutting blade, pretty much to where it's going to be after the grinding and all the polishing and everything. It's just the very edge that I'm going to grind, so it's still going to have this kind of as forged finish on it. So I'm just going to throw it back in, give it a straighten, and then it should be good to normalize and heat treat. It's important to keep the faces of the hammer nice and clean so that you're not putting a bunch of stuff on the blade. So now I'm going to do like kind of a rough normalize, which basically means I'm going to let the blade relax for a bit. It obviously doesn't really want to be hammered on, so I'm going to kind of let it heat up and then not do any work to it. It will help the grain of the steel relax a bit. So because that was kind of a rough normalizing cycle, it's slightly warped to the side, but when I do the kiln normalizing, we can straighten it back out. So before I make a knife, I do usually draw them, but in a case like this where I'm making a kitchen knife, a lot of the time I'll find one that's relatively close in drawings that I've already done, because I've drawn, I don't know, probably hundreds of kitchen knives by now. I will find a knife that I like that's roughly the shape, and I'll take little aspects of it. So it won't exactly match, not making the same knife again necessarily, but I'm going to try to find something that I like the shape of. Like this is sort of the Giotto that I make a lot of, and I'll take like the tip shape. Cool. So now we get kitted up for the grinding room. done some normalizing cycles on this, and it's come out pretty straight on that last one, so I think it's pretty much ready for hardening. I'm gonna leave that in there for like 5 minutes or so to let it really nicely soak, to make sure that temperature is all the way through the blade. And then I'm gonna pull it out and quench it in the oil, and hopefully we'll have a hard blade. We've just taken the blade out of the tempering cycle, and it's looking pretty good. There's a little warp in the tang, so we'll have to fix that. But I tested it with Rockwell files, and it's looking like it's right around 60 after the tempering, which is pretty good. Prior to heat treatment, we obviously did the forging, sort of got the blade to a very rough shape. From there, we did the profiling, got it all profiled nicely and made sure that everything was straight going into the quench. The normalizing to kind of relax the grain, make sure the quench was going to go as well as possible. And then in the quench, we found that the tang sort of moved to the side just a little bit. But luckily, that's kind of the best place for a warp, because we can really soften that area and get it back to straight. So yeah, our next step is going to be straightening that out, and then we're going to get on to the grinding. One really important part of this step, particularly when I'm working on the blade, I don't want any of the color to spread down to the edge. Of course, you can't see the color on the sides because it's covered in scale, but on the shiny edge that I've just ground a tiny bit off, if I start to see any color anywhere, that means I'm reducing the hardness of the blade, which to an extent isn't a bad thing, but there's a point where you've just removed all the work that you've done going into the actual hardening step. I might do the tang. For that, I'm going to use this tool. This is a tool I got from an Australian company called Nordic Edge. And it's a carbide file guide. So a lot of people use these for bevels to get a really nice plunge line. You can kind of clamp it there, and then your belts aren't going to grind into this because this is carbide. But rather than using it for bevels, I tend to use it mostly for tangs. So now that that's on there, I've got a really solid reference, and I can basically just grind my tang all the way up to this. It will be really nice and square, so when I come up to fitting it into a handle, I don't really have to deal with any wobbly edges or anything like that. It should just kind of slot right on, and then if the top of my block is flat, it should theoretically sit nice and flat against the shoulders of the tang. Now that I've got the tang all squared up, I can take it out of this contraption. We've got really nice, sharp shoulders, and when it comes to fitting up the handle, that will sit really nicely against a block of something that has a hole in it, so that should just sit real nice. I'm not going to use this handle, but I think that looks pretty good. So next step is to just kind of go through the grits, getting that edge down, yeah, giving this a good cutting geometry, make it an actual functional tool. So I've just come out of the grinding room. I've got the blade all sort of finished ground. I took it through basically 60 grit to kind of rough in, establish the apex of the knife. 120 grit to kind of further push that closer to 0. A couple of surface conditioning belts just to make the scratches, the deeper scratches, easier to see. And then I went to the disc grinder and kind of got everything flat and sort of more consistent. And now that the edge is pretty much where I want it all the way along, I'm going to start hand sanding. The nice thing about coming off the disc grinder is I'm using the same abrasive that I'm using for this on the disc. So the grinder scratches are really harsh and really sharp. The actual like grit is quite triangular. And so it leaves these really kind of sharp scratches. Whereas the disc, I find I can put a little less pressure on. It leaves slightly more rounded scratches. And it means the hand sanding goes way, way quicker. Once you've developed the skills of using the grinder and using the disc grinder, you can get really nice flat grinds that are quite consistent. And they're really easy to hand sand. But when I was first starting out, I didn't really have that. So it's basically just using files. And the size of the teeth on this file it's like each tooth is like a millimeter. So the size of the scratches that I was putting in each knife was massive. When I was hand sanding, it took ages. It took, I don't know, hand sanding this much bevel with a file finish probably took me 3-4 hours. And eventually my dad was kind enough to buy me a belt grinder. And I thought, before I got the grinder, I was like, this is gonna be the biggest step up in my knife making. It's gonna mean that I don't have to spend 3 hours hand sanding every knife. I'm gonna be just popping knives out left, right, and center. But what I found was I didn't have the skill. I started grinding knives and I was spending just as much time hand sanding because I was creating all these facets. And what's worse than a scratch is actually just a bunch of material that you weren't able to remove. Getting all the tools is one thing. You can get all the tools in the world, but if you don't know how to use them and you don't develop the techniques you need in order to actually make good use of them, you're never really gonna get to the point where you can say that you've actually achieved what you thought that tool was going to give you. This bevel is pretty much completely hand sanded, apart from this one scratch that's right there. That's a pretty deep scratch. I think that's probably left over from the 60 grit, which is the very first pass I took on the grinder. And just contrasting this with how I used to make knives with the file, I would have had maybe 800 of those scratches across the length of the bevel that I'd have to get out. And I've only been doing this for maybe, I don't know, 10 minutes. With this knife, the design that I was sort of going for was a sort of a Japanese-inspired general kitchen knife. The Japanese name for a sort of shape similar to this one. This one's a little more Western than sort of a normal Gyuto would be, but the name is a Gyuto. And generally they have a fairly straight spine until the end, and then it kind of dips down a little bit. There's another shape called the Santoku, which would sort of dip down even more and the edge would be even more flat, but this shape is sort of more westernized. So it's got a little bit more belly than it normally would, which gives you more sort of rocking ability, so you can rock the knife on the cutting board. But it's not so curved that it's on the German sort of side of things or the very Western side of things. A lot of Western knives will have a bolster that runs into the blade, and that makes sharpening harder. It's seen as a safety feature, but really you shouldn't have your hands anywhere near the heel of the knife anyway. But yeah, this knife is sort of my idea of what home cooks sort of like to use. They like a slightly smaller blade, that this sort of 180 millimeter length is around about the length that they find manageable. You can use it in your hands, so while you're processing food in your hands, or you can use it on the cutting board. It's just a nice little size. So another thing about this knife is I've tried to forge the majority of the geometry in. And by doing that, it's meant that I've left most of the scale on the blade. So it's only really the edge that's gonna have the final polish on it. But that also means that out of the forge I had to get it quite thin. And because I'm not at the stage where I'm comfortable forging to sort of laser thinness in terms of geometry, it's still what would be considered in the knife world as a workhorse. So a workhorse generally has a thicker sort of edge geometry. So the convex that is formed by the difference between the ground portion and the unground portion is where most of the food release is going to be happening. But for sort of hardier vegetables, pumpkin, carrot, harder things that are more prone to splitting, they're going to have a harder time passing over this thicker geometry, so there might be a little bit of splitting. But at the same time, the extra weight of this and the extra sort of thickness in the change in geometry from this flat plane where I've ground to this sort of textured plane where it's been forged means that the food release is going to be better, and the added weight in this blade is going to help it cut through food a little more. Overall, the performance features that you get from forging a blade, not to final thinness, but to sort of something slightly proud of that, you can balance the specs, which I guess gives me a little bit of leeway. I can call something a workhorse when I haven't forged it crazy thin. But there are people who like that kind of grind. There are also people who like barely any convexity, and it just is pretty much straight to the edge. I definitely like something in between. Either way, it's going to be a fun knife to use. So for this bevel, we're going to go up to 1000 grit. And what that's going to do is, one, it's going to look quite cool because it'll be really shiny. The other thing that that's going to do is it's going to mean that there's less surface area. So if you imagine the sort of each scratch is a zigzag in the blade, I'm making the zigzag as small as possible in terms of the actual like surface of the edge. What's nice about this scale finish is this scale actually protects the raw steel from oxidizing. So this portion I'm not super worried about, but this portion I want to kind of give it as much opportunity to not oxidize too much as possible. Being a carbon steel, it is going to oxidize. It's going to patina. It's just natural, but I find patina quite cool because it sort of tells the story of what the knife's cut. Gives you these cool colors that come on the blade. Yeah, that's one of the reasons I like carbon steel. The last couple sort of steps, I'm making sure that all the scratches from the previous grits are out. So I'm using this light and I'm kind of moving my head around to make sure that I'm seeing everything. Then the final step of the hand sanding is making sure there are no J hooks. So this is like a kind of a more difficult thing to see because all the scratches are the same now, but there's the occasional time where you'll sand and then you'll move slightly to the side and then you'll pull back and it creates this like little loop. And visually that just doesn't look nice. So basically just want to push quite hard, do some slow pulls, trying to stay as straight as possible. And it just makes the actual edge look really a lot nicer. Cool, so I've just come out of the grinding room once again. All I did was really just kind of round over the spine and choil, so they're very much shinier now, and they're also nice and rounded, so they're very comfortable against your fingers. Now that they're sanded to about 400 grit off the grinder, I'm just gonna really quickly polish them up by hand, and we can get started on the handle. Last thing, I'm gonna put some super glue in the touch mark, and that will basically just darken it up, make it pop a little bit. Okay, so now that we're finished hand sanding, it's time to move on to the handle. We're gonna start by making the bolster out of this, I don't know, maybe 8mm thick bronze. We're gonna cut off a little chunk of that, mill a slot in it, get it all polished up. After we've done that, I'm going to cut out a chunk of this really nicely figured walnut, and we'll use that as the main body of the handle. I did the measurements to the 0.1 of a millimeter, but because these calipers are real old and they're not particularly good calipers, it's just kind of giving me a rough idea of where I want that slot to be. What will really be doing most of the work is my DRO that I have on my mill, which you'll see in a second. Once it's to the right width, I can widen it the other way a little bit. I left it 0.2 of a millimeter not wide enough, so we should see that it doesn't fit up. But that's kind of what we want. We want it to be tighter rather than looser. We can always make it wider, but it's very hard to make it looser again. So I'm gonna go grind a little bit more off the tang because I don't think it tapers as much as I need it to be. I think this side is still pretty much parallel. Once I grind that off, we'll see what happens, and then it will probably be 2 hand files to finish off the fitment of the bolster. All right, so now that I've got the tang slot and now the tang actually tapering, it's hitting right about there. And from this point, because it wiggles a little bit, I'm gonna start using a hammer to get it on. And that's gonna do 2 things. One, it's gonna push it further up. It may even push it all the way to where I need it to be. But if it doesn't, it's also going to rub on the inside of that tang slot that I've just made. And wherever it rubs, it means that's where it's contacting the tang, and that's where I have to remove material because that's what's stopping it from moving all the way up. All right. Just gonna mark that side because I wanna, from now on, make sure I'm fitting it up the same way every time. The thing when you're forging a knife is you're making the surfaces all irregular. What I got off the mill was a perfectly rectangular slot with rounded corners. And because this tang was forged and it was hammered on and kind of manipulated, it's never gonna be exactly rectangular. Yeah, we're just gonna have to kind of custom fit it to all the little contours of the forged finish. About 4 millimeters away from it being fit up, so that needs to sit all the way up to the little shoulders there. And then once it's fit up to those shoulders, I'm gonna make tiny little pockets for those shoulders to sit into in this brass, or in the bronze, sorry. And that's gonna do 2 things. One, it's going to provide a little bit of support right where that transition is, because it's a kind of sharp transition. And 2, it's gonna hide any kind of gaps that I have underneath these 2 shoulders if I were to have any gaps. But I'm gonna go give this a harder whack outside and hopefully it will fit up. Cool, so it's very, very, very close. We've got maybe 0.2 of a millimeter left before it hits those shoulders. But that's plenty of space for me to now start making these little pockets. So I have another knife here, and it has these little pockets for the what's called the ricasso, which is the bit right before the blade. And those, it just sits in there and it locks in really nicely and provides a little bit of support for that transition. To create that little pocket on this piece of bronze, I'm going to scribe the profile of my ricasso onto the bronze. I'm going to knock it off, and then I'm going to use the mill to just go down maybe 1-2 millimeters, probably not 2, probably closer to 1. And then we'll use this little micro motor here to kind of fine tune it and make sure it fits perfectly. So part of the milling of the pockets is not milling enough. So I don't want to mill all the way to the edges of those scribe lines because I want to use the corners of these shoulders to kind of shave away the material that's left. It's sitting off of it at the moment, but that fits up perfectly, and we've got our little pockets in so that the ricasso is kind of supported by the bolster. The next step is to get the wooden portion of the handle fit up. So we're doing a sort of wah style handle for this one. So I'm basically just going to cut a little skinny block out of this, trying to capture sort of the more figured part of the wood, either on that side or that side. I haven't quite decided which yet. And then we'll just do the same thing, basically mill a slot, get this fit up, and then we're gonna glue it, and then we'll be able to shape the knife, get it finally finished. Sweet, so we have the handle block. So all I'm gonna do now is just mill the sides, get those nice and flat. Then we're gonna put a slot in it, and then glue it up. So the knife has been glued. Now I basically just have to shape it, do a little bit of sanding, and that is the knife done. So I'm gonna start grinding this handle down now, making sure to keep everything straight with the blade. We're just gonna go for a nice simple round handle. Cool, so that's basically the knife done. All that's left is sharpening, but the handle turned out really cool. I just love all the texture and kind of depth that walnut has. I really like the thickness of the bolster, the sort of little subtle shapes that we have in it. But overall, yeah, it just looks like a really cool, very happy little knife. So now I'm gonna sharpen it. Gonna start out with a 400 grit diamond stone and then work my way up through my progressive grits before stropping, and then we'll give it a little sharpness test just to see how it works.